So hi, my name is Virginia Beck. I work with the Public Access Room here at the State Capitol. And tonight we're going to be talking about some odd things that happen at the state legislature. We've given lots of workshops on how a bill becomes a law and the standard way that things work. But we recognize that sometimes things don't go quite as planned. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we can get started. So our beautiful Capitol building, which is now open to the public, all you need is an ID and you can come in. Some places you need to be masked, other places they just request it. And as I just mentioned, usually the legislative process unfolds just as we outlined it, how a bill becomes a law. And, they go through the committees, they get changed along the way, things are predictable. We've even got a little schematic that shows, from an idea, it's introduced. After it's introduced, it gets its first reading, the first vote on the floor, gets referred to committees, then it knows which committees it has to go through in order to survive, and then second and third reading, and then over to the other chamber, go through the same process, and then come down to the conference process, which can get a little bit messy there, and then off to the governor, who signs the bill into law, allows it to become law without signature, or if he vetoes it, override the veto. So that's how things usually work. And usually they have House and Senate rules that they follow, and you can find those on the legislature's website. There's a House and a Senate tab on the right-hand side, and you can find their rules. And they need to give at least 48 hours notice in advance of a hearing. The Senate has to give 72 hours notice for the first time that it's hearing a bill. And so we talk with advocates about this, and we explain that committees don't meet every day of the week, so you've got to work backwards and go, okay, well, if they've only met on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the deadline's on Thursday, then Wednesday's the last time, so they've got to get their hearing notice out by Monday, except that sometimes they don't have the 48 hours notice. So they can be granted a waiver on the floor, and it can be, this is an example of a waiver that was given one day before they were going to hear a bill. And these waivers, there's no way to predict them. They don't show up on the agenda or the order of the day for the chamber. It's instead just a request that's made to the presiding president or vice president, speaker or vice speaker, and it's made at the end of session during the announcement section. And, in the rules, you can look at the rules, but there's no set, list of these are good reasons and these will be acknowledged and these are bad reasons. They could be kind of vague. Here's an example where Senator Taniguchi noted, it's basically, we had to get both of the chairs and we didn't get it out in time. So we need to have a waiver, and the waiver was granted. So it's not done that often, but just know that it can happen. That's why it's so important to sign up for those hearing notices by email so you don't get surprised. So now usually bills will get referred to their committees after their first reading, and we know exactly the path that a bill has to go through in order to get through the chamber. And, those are we've got deadlines for bills to get into their last committee and out of their last committee, all that kind of thing. Usually that's what happens, but every now and then there's a re-referral. Sometimes the re-referral is done because the bill has changed and it needs to be sent to different committees, or maybe there was a mistake. So maybe there was a mistake in the initial referral, or it could be that a certain chair wants the opportunity to hear or doesn't want to hear a certain bill. Sometimes it's as simple that a deadline is passed and the bill is going to die unless it gets a committee re-referral. So here's one example of a bill that was referred to, had a double referral to HHS, and the committees have all changed over the years. They changed the acronyms, but it's got HHS and then a joint referral, and it made it through HHS and was referred, past second reading and was referred on to the next joint committee. But then the lateral deadline was coming up and it wasn't going to meet it. It got re-referred to just HHS. So all of a sudden it's alive again and it can be past third reading and go off to the other side. So that's a re-referral to, they do a reconsideration of the action taken because they had referred it to the committee. And now they're saying, we're taking that back. We're not referring it to the committee. Instead, we're going to pass it on third reading. Here's another example of a bill that had a triple referral. And this one was right up to the decking deadline. And all of a sudden it got re-referred to finance all by itself. And that afternoon, finance had a hearing and passed it out with amendments. So that was very unusual. Very unusual, but it can happen. And if something like that happens, that bill actually made it all the way to conference. So one of the things they'll do is they'll re-refer it again back to all of those different committees that are the subject matter of the bill so that the chairs can participate during the conference process. Here's an example of one where Ways and Means was supposed to hold a decision making, but they waived the referral and just said, we don't need to hear it. We'll just let it go by and pass third reading. So this is a wordy slide, but it basically reminds us of prior concurrence. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's that if I'm the chair of a second committee, I can't change the bill that's before me in a way that the chair of the first committee would not like. So I need to get prior concurrence. I need to get agreement that this is an okay change to make. And usually that's respected. There was an example of a time when in a triple referral, the EEP committee created an HD1, CPC changed it, but they didn't get prior concurrence from the first committee. So finance announced that since there wasn't prior concurrence, they were changing the bill back to the way it was when it left EEP. So it became an HD3, even though that HD3 was identical to the HD1. Now, usually changes that are made don't alter the entire bill. Usually, the title cannot change, and it's got to reflect the content of the bill. And usually just parts of the bill change. But there are times when they do what they call a gut and replace, where they take the bill stays the same, the title of the bill stays the same, but the entire contents of the bill are stripped and new content is put in. And this can be used to introduce a new idea. There was a recent Hawaii Supreme Court opinion back in November that said basically that gut and replace, as the legislature had been practicing it, was not constitutional, and that any changes that were made had to be germane to the bill and make sure that it still gets three readings or votes on the floor of each chamber. And we're still going to have to see how that's going to play out. Noah, do you have a question?
I do. I have a question on gut and replace.
Okay.
So does that Supreme Court decision speak to like the contents of the bill and also to when the gut and replace happens, or is it more about the contents of the bill? Like they can't do this completely empty bill that just says relating to health or relating to agriculture or something like that.
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and I would refer you to the court's website to really read the decision, because it's not entirely clear to me what the implications are. And so it may affect when they do a gut and replace, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the old days, they could gut and replace bills to an extreme. This is what prompted the lawsuit, was this kind of thing where they had a bill that was relating to the structure of government. Well, it was originally about the Department of the Environment. It became something about the State Energy Office, and then it was all of a sudden it was the Stadium Authority District. So very different, not germane. Or, you know, I can't say whether that's germane or not, but I think that would be a hard one to argue. Usually when they do make a significant change, they will either hold a decision making and then put the bill back into committee to hear the bill, or they'll put it up on the hearing notice as a proposed draft. So this is how the House would say, okay, this is the proposed HD2 that we want to hear, and they'll have a link to it so that you can testify on that proposed HD2, or here's a proposed SD1, that kind of thing. But sometimes, you know, in the past there haven't been hearings available, and I think this is one of the things that's frustrating, and this kind of goes to Noah's question as well, in that, you know, does it matter when you change the bill whether or not there has been adequate opportunity for public hearing or for those reading votes? So this was a bill relating to UH and CIP funds and contracted positions, and it got changed after it was brought forward for decision making into a bill on Mauna Kea. It was still relating to the University of Hawaii, but that was a surprise to a lot of people. And sometimes it would be incremental, like there was a bill about distance learning that got changed. It got added this whole thing about the Board of Regents, and then when it went to conference, they ended up deleting the original stuff and keeping the added stuff. So it was kind of like a creeper of a gut and replace. There were also cases of piggybacking bills, and I don't think this will be allowed either. You know, you've got to keep it to the title of the bill, but that left a lot of room. And the question now is, how much room is there? How do you define germane to the content of the bill? But here's an example that was kind of obviously strange. There was a bill that was basically talking about how close a car can come to a bicyclist. Okay, it got changed, and they added $500,000 for the city and county van pool program. So not, you know, still relating to motor vehicles, but is that the same bill? I don't know. So that was about gut and replace, and I really am curious how it's all going to play out this this session. Yes, Noah.
Sorry, just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So that Supreme Court, that was a state Supreme Court decision?
Right.
Okay, so that was just very recent, is that right? So we don't
That's
really
very
know
recent.
exactly all the implications yet.
That was back in November. So this is the first session that they're having to, you know, do their business with the Supreme Court ruling looking over them, and that's why I don't know, you know, what they'll do. I don't know if they'll, you know, say they gut and replace a bill and then they add more hearings or more readings onto the end of the session so that they can say, okay, after we changed the bill, we had 1, 2, 3 readings so that it would pass the constitutional muster.
Thank you.
I don't know.
We have a bill that was changed significantly in its very, very first committee.
Okay.
And I think probably that it's okay, but I want to go read that ruling now.
Yes, yeah, it's really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the legislators have an idea of what they think the implications of it are.
Yeah.
And they're, you know, acting under that assumption.
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope that if I'm a legislator, especially leadership, I would hope that they have been talking about this and working out what the parameters should be and how they should go about things. So usually they make changes in committee, like we've been talking about. They, you know, bring it up for a hearing and make a change when they pass it forward. But sometimes they can also change bills on the floor. They can make what they call floor amendments. And they are offered by a member. They can just move to amend a bill that's being considered. This usually happens on third reading. And they'll have a vote on whether the amendment is adopted. And if the amendment is adopted, then if it's on third reading, they'll have to wait 48 hours before they can vote on the amended bill, because there is that 48-hour requirement before voting on the third or final time on a bill. Short forms bills, Noah mentioned these, bills that have no content, and quite often they just sit there and nothing ever happens to them. But they are occasionally brought up as a tool to move a new idea forward. And they can either be brought up for a public hearing as a proposed draft, or they could be brought up for decision making, go forward to the floor, and then get recommitted to the committee for a hearing. So this is what a short form bill looks like. It's got its title, which is about all that it is. Otherwise, it's just a non-content bill. And this is showing you the notice of decision making, and they will try to explain that, you know, they're just doing this in order to change a short form bill and get it into motion. And so here's what it looks like on your bill status sheet. They say, well, they'll hold a decision making, they'll pass it with changes, so it's no longer a short form bill. It gets reported out, gets recommitted to the committee, then they can have a public hearing. And then because the content has changed, it's usually re-referred to different committees. Now, effective dates, we talk a lot about the defective, effective dates. Those are no longer uncommon. They are everywhere. It seems like almost every bill has a defective date where they've put a far ahead date in order to force the bill to go to conference. And if that, we call it a defective date, but if it was passed, it would actually not invalidate the law. So sometimes mistakes can happen. And one of the things that happened back in 2007, back then they thought 2025 was way far ahead. Now it seems like it's right around the corner. But they had a bill about taro being the official state plant, and they had a defective date in it, but they neglected to change it. It went through the House with a defective date, crossed over to the Senate, and the Senate approved it without making any changes, and the House just sent it off to the governor. The governor, Linda Lingle at the time, said, well, I'm going to go ahead and sign this, and you guys fix it later. This happened again just recently. In 2019, there was a bill that was about Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month, and it had a defective date of 2050 on it. And it passed through the House, went over to the Senate, and the Senate didn't make any changes on it. They did not correct the defective date. Well, when it came back to the House, I guess the House didn't notice it and sent it off to the governor. So the legislature then said, oh, sorry, will you send it back? The governor did return the bill. However, and then the legislature fixed the bill and sent it back off to the governor. But the governor said, oh no, the original version that you sent over has now become law without signature, so I'm going to veto this amended bill, and that's not going to become law. So that was kind of messy. We don't like it when that happens. And it's not been corrected. So if you look in the statute books, you'll find Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month is actually not effective until July 1, 2050. So they need to come back and fix that if they want to do that. So now most of the time when they take votes in committees, they will vote for passage of a bill. So it'll be brought forward to pass it with or without changes. But sometimes they will recommend that the measure is held and want to take a vote to put it on record that we're holding this bill. We are not going to move this bill forward. Very unusual for that to happen. It's usually, it's very unusual. The other thing that's unusual is for them to recommend passage and for the recommendation not to be adopted. So that hardly ever happens. And usually it happens when it's an issue that's gotten quite a bit of attention. And even though the chair knows that the motion will not pass, they want to get this on the record that they've all voted on it. So not very common at all. And sometimes, you know, we talk about when bills die, and usually the rule of thumb is if the committee says the bill is deferred without saying a date for that bill to be considered again, it's considered dead. In this case, on the 16th, you would have thought the bill was dead, but on the 20th, they decided, oh, we're going to schedule it for decision making, and they passed it out with changes. So it was revived. So the nice thing these days is that we've got YouTube recordings of all of the hearings. So if this happened to my bill, I would be able to say, oh, 316, the House, I can go to the House YouTube page, look up the YouTube proceeding and see what was said about the deferral. And they can also make a decision and unmake the decision. So this is an example of a bill that passed without any changes. And then they said, oh, wait, we're going to reconsider that. And they came back a few days later and passed it with changes. So I guess they just needed some time to, they realized they did want to make some changes to that and needed a few days to get that together. And sometimes that can take a little while, passed with changes, reconsider, deleted from decision-making, reconsider. Here's one that was deferred, 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 finally passed with amendments. So sometimes it takes a bit of patience here at the Capitol to see what's going on. One time I've seen a very strange thing, which was a bill was passed with changes, but then was never reported out of committee. So it died. It failed to make its deadlines. And that was very unusual. And I looked in the rules, and there's nothing in the House rules, I don't think, that says that they must report it out. So the other thing about the rules is they can make exceptions to their own rules. Another odd thing that can happen is you can have disjointed committees. You know, when you've got a joint referral, usually the committees will both pass the bill without changes, or they'll both pass with changes, or they'll both defer the bill. But sometimes it doesn't happen that way. So here's an example where one of the committees deferred it and the other committee passed it with changes. In this case, they tried to go ahead and revive it by saying, okay, well, let's re-refer it, so it just has to go to Waterland and then on to JGO-WHAM, to give them a little bit more time to try to get JGO on board. And it looks like that never happened. So both of the committees have to move it forward. Recommitment is something that's done on the floor in session, and it's moving the bill back to the committee that it came from. And this is something that we saw being done with short form bills. It's also a way to kill a bill if it's come forward, but maybe it's not, maybe they discovered something that was wrong with it, so they're putting it back into committee rather than voting on it and moving it forward. Here's one that was reported, resolution that was reported from Ways and Means and then was recommitted to Ways and Means. So it just didn't get the adopting vote on the floor. And every now and then you'll get one where they're recommitting it to conference committee. So this one was reported out and looked good, passed final reading in the Senate, but then in the House they recommitted it and that killed the bill. So usually it's up to the chair of the committee. The chair has the power to call for a vote or decide to defer a bill. But there is a mechanism to pull bills out of committee. This always appeals to people when they've got a chair who's not in line with their idea. But it's very, very rarely done. They respect the power of the chair, and that the chair is the one who gets to decide what bills should move forward out of the committee. It takes a 1/3 vote of the members, and the only time that I can recall it happening was back in 2009 with civil unions, and when the bill was in the Judiciary Committee, and they had a tie vote on passage, so it did not pass, and they tried to recall it a month later, and then right near the end of session they tried to recall it and did recall it, and so they brought it to the floor. It ultimately did not pass, but it was a heroic effort there. most of the time when you have a floor vote at session, you've probably noticed that most of the bills that are up for a vote on the floor are going to pass the vote. That usually happens. Most bills are killed in committee. But every now and then, you'll get something that you know, it looks, here's one that made it all the way through the House and the Senate and then failed at the last moment, just failed the final reading by one vote. Usually when we have single chamber resolutions and concurrent resolutions, which you've seen a lot of in the last week or so, you'll see that they are considered kind of in tandem with one another, so that if the concurrent resolution fails to go through in the other chamber, at least you've got this single chamber resolution. But sometimes they don't do it that way. Sometimes they'll go ahead, and here's an example where one became, you know, and they can change everything in the resolution. It doesn't, they can change the title, the content, everything. And this is one where the SCR 154 got changed quite a bit, and SR 114 ended up being adopted and being about something quite different. And usually at the end of session, when right before conference, we've got the House and the Senate returning the bills to the other chamber. So all the House bills will come back to the House and all the Senate bills will come back to the Senate. And the originating chamber will notice whether or not the bills have been changed while they were away. And if they've been changed, they will usually disagree with the changes. That's the standard default setting. If they want to agree to the changes, they have to do a little bit of paperwork to advocate for an agree vote instead. So it's not usually done. And they can also disagree. It can go to conference, and then they can change their mind and say, you know what, actually this bill is in good shape. We could go ahead and agree to the changes you made, and off it can go. They can take a final vote and off it can go to the governor. Now, for that to happen, the bill has to have a good effective date in there, which spoils that option for a lot of bills. Here's one where the House conference manager said, okay, we're going to agree to the Senate amendments. And so on the floor of the House, they said, we're going to reconsider our disagree vote, and we're going to vote to agree. And here's their voting to agree, and then they vote to pass it on final reading. And off it goes to the governor. And usually bills that survive conference survive. You know, if they, I don't know how many bills make it out of conference. I think about 2/3 of them make it out. But most of those will pass their final reading votes and go off to the governor. But the bill can be recommitted by one or both of the chambers. So they can do that if, say, the conference committees came up with a CD1 version, but the other members of the chamber have looked at that and think, no, there's something wrong with this, we want to send it back. They'll recommit it. Or the vote can proceed, but it can fail to pass the final reading, which can also happen. And after conference, it's unusual, but you know, I mentioned you can have floor amendments. You can have a floor amendment after the conference process is done. So the CD1 version of the bill comes out of conference and goes to the House and the Senate for a final reading vote. And on the floor, each chamber introduced or moves to change the bill in the same way. So the amendments have to be identical, and they can both vote to adopt those amendments. They'll have to wait 48 hours before they can vote for the final time on the bill. And if they do, off it'll go to the governor. And it will be considered a CD2, even though it happens on the floor. And carryover bills, there's a provision that if a carryover bill passes the other chamber and comes back to the originating chamber, it has to have at least one vote in the originating chamber before it can go off to the governor. It's in the Constitution. It's just the way it's got to be. There was a House bill back in 2018 that was a carryover bill from 2017, and it passed through the Senate without getting any changes made to it. But then when it came to the House, instead of taking a final reading vote, they referred it to conference. And I'm not sure why they did that, but whether it was a mistake or whether it was to kill it, I don't know. Why is always the question that we have a hard time answering in the public access room. So finally, vetoes. Vetoes are unusual. Usually the governor will either sign bills into law or allow them to become law without signature. And if he does veto the bill, the option is usually for the legislature to decide to reconvene and override the veto with a 2/3 vote of both chambers. But we just had an example in 2021 where they had a special session because the governor vetoed a number of bills, and they overrode the veto on a number of the bills, but they also did something else that was very unusual, which was they amended the bills to meet the governor's objections, and then they voted on those bills in each chamber and then returned them to the governor, who then signed them into law within 10 days, and they became law. So that's a very unusual procedure to go through. This is finally, decorum on the floor. Usually they're in suits and jackets, but on Friday they wear aloha wear. They usually refer to other members by their district or their area. Rather than the name, they only talk to the presiding president or a speaker. And they've got to wait to be acknowledged and, you know, follow the rules that are set down in the House and Senate rules and in Mason's manual, which also helps to guide procedures. But sometimes, you know, things happen. And there was an example when one of the senators refused to stop speaking when he was not speaking about the bill. And so the sergeant at arms has the responsibility of removing people from the floor who are out of order. And so this is just a little quote from Ben Villaflor, who had to do it a few times. So those are some of the odd things that have happened. The thing to remember is the House and Senate rules are available to you. You can look through them. They are their rules, and they can make exceptions to those rules. Now, things that are set out in the state constitution have to be followed. And as I mentioned, we're going to have to see what effect that Supreme Court decision has on the practices at the legislature. And if you ever see anything you don't understand, please don't hesitate to contact the public access room, and we'll be happy to try to help you out. And that's it from me, and I'll stop my sharing and see if there are any questions. Okay, let's see. So how many bills are normally introduced? Usually about, gosh, I think 2,500, something like that. And usually about 10% will become law. And let's see. Oh, someone made a mistake and asked for email here notices and got inundated. Okay, that can happen. It takes some getting used to knowing what you need to follow. Yeah, so don't hesitate to contact the public access room and use us to help you hone in on what would be meaningful for you to watch. And we'll be happy to help you out with that. So that's all I've got, and I thank you for joining me, and I'm going to stop the recording and say good night.